Be here now.
These remarks are in honor of Aldous Huxley and also of Laura Huxley. That, in fact, without Laura Huxley, this lecture would not be happening. And never underestimate the power of Laura Huxley. In fact, I have to show, Laura, I must show you that I am wearing the socks. She demanded that I wear higher stockings. She said it was improper to wear such, so I have calf stockings for Laura. And when she asked me to speak about Aldous, to say I was intimidated was a mild statement. My last image, or one of the images I have of Aldous, not my last one, but one of them, I'm at a party in the Hollywood Hills, and I have never met Aldous. And in the corner, in two chairs, chatting, are Gerald Hurd and Aldous Huxley, two giants of the intellect. And I'm a young, brash Turk from Harvard, recently psychedelicized. So I am now becoming one of the darlings of the Hollywood set, as a connection, no doubt. And so I sidle over in order to listen. And I hear them discussing the experience of walking through the labyrinths of abbeys, of abbey gardens, and the feelings that it generates. And the associative tracks of these people. Aldous was 4 years older than my father. So my relationship to Aldous is one of awe and deep respect. And for me to even presume to speak about him and about his work humbles me. And what I've gotten from readings this winter of some of Aldous's work is not so much a set of answers, although they are loaded with answers, but a very provocative experience, forcing me to the edge of my consciousness time and again to explore the issues that he was exploring. And I can understand his saying to Jean, well, then you must do it, when she was unwilling to allow the solution that Aldous had arrived at in Ireland. A little while I'll discuss these books, but first, dealing with one of the provocative issues. And it's an issue that I think pervades these meetings. Because these meetings have been full of the most beautiful possibilities for our ultimate investment. Experiences and dreams and programs and plans. But at the same moment, underlying it, was the continuous question, is it too late? Is it too dark? Are we just a little whisper in the roaring winds of a tornado? What do we do? Do we need to do something dramatic? The question to Ashley last night was, couldn't you go on the Bill Moyer show so millions of people could hear that what we need to do is love one another? And he said, well, Bill Moyers doesn't really want to hear that. He didn't say it that way, but that's roughly. There's not really too much room for good news. Some time ago, I was connected, maybe 20 years ago, with a Tibetan Lama named Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. He and I taught together at Naropa the first year. And in response to this question about despair, Trungpa said, one has to stand halfway between hope and hopelessness. If one is afraid of looking at the hopeless part, one is no longer free to act in a free way because one's anxiety about the outcome colors one's perception so deeply that one is unable to experience the gestalt out of which an appropriate response occurs. That one must look at the possibility that it all turns dark and darker and darker. I remember once being in the near the temple that I'm connected with in India, in the foothills of the Himalayas, Kumaon Hills, and visiting the ashram of a saint who had lived maybe 50, 60 years ago, Sambari Maharaj. And when one of his devotees had asked him, he said, there will come a time when you will walk 5 miles and you will see a light, a firelight in the distance, and you'll be so happy to know another human being still is alive. This was a man who had great, great wisdom and siddhis, or powers. And that image chilled me deeply. Was I really ready for Shiva's dance? And in this morning presentation, we'll have the delight of Chung Liang, Al Wang, and I dancing to Shiva. Because I think if we come out of this conference with the willingness to undertake the venture to look directly at what is, setting aside our dramatic responses, just looking at what is, out of that will come very intuitively your next act. And it will be the optimum act that you can make. Edmund Burke said, what you do may seem insignificant, but it's very important that you do it. I'm sorry, he said, there's 2 lines I have. Well, that's Gandhi. Burke's line was, the worst mistake is to do nothing because you can only do a little. As Brother David in the group discussion last night talked about us trying to solve the problems at the level at which our minds are functioning, rather than having relationship with the mystery of the universe and staying at the edge of the mystery of the universe with the unknown and still acting. He said there are forces behind what one can see, of which we are part. When I find that somebody calls because they are sick or frightened, and I am on the phone and I find myself feeling deeply peaceful and listening and feeling my heart responding to their pain, and at the same moment, the equanimity of being with the mystery, and watch the process happen between the two of us. I just feel that the two of us make up the beautiful, beautiful relationship between compassion, the giving and the receiving of the compassionate moment. And it's one thing. And nobody's doing anything for anybody. It's a process, and we are gathered here because we are part of the compassionate response. And it's interesting that the purer one's heart becomes, the more the tiniest act is that which resonates in an appropriate fashion to bring a deeper harmony, a deeper way back into the Tao, as if one never left it. These are the kinds of questions that Aldous's work awakens in me. He calls forth, just as he did in Jean, he calls forth in me the desire to be the pure instrument. When one sees there is nothing left but purification and remembrance. Every time I forget, I remember. And of course, every time I remember, I forget. Until the forgetting and the remembering are all part of one thing. Ah, forgetting. Ah, remembering. You and I are embarked on such an extraordinary dance, which is what Aldous was embarked on himself. Now, I've been reflecting about Aldous's life, and Jean gave one interpretation. Aldous was he was often referred to as a dispassionate person. We also know he was very passionate about what he believed in, but he was a dispassionate person. Now, Ashley spoke last night about the cold fish style that came out of the English educational system. So I've been entertaining whether Aldous's dispassion was a kind of caring cold fishness, a kind of the neurosis of a culture, the kind of fear of intimacy, the fear of distancing himself. Was it reserve and psychological defense? Because that would be a reasonable argument. Who then, in the course of his life, was brought into a deep, deep, intimate relationship with the mystery. And if that is the story of his life, then it is an incredible hero's myth of somebody that starts out within the intellect and then tames the intellect until he is that wisdom heart out of which intellect speaks. And that is a hero's journey that any of us would love to emulate, to get out of being caught in our own minds. But I've entertained another speculation. I've considered the possibility that he's just a very old soul. He's sort of like an old lama who took birth in a certain culture with a certain style. And that as his life went on, he was just looking through culture and then moving for the proper métier to express the wisdom he had all along. And that first he did it within that kind of skeptical social satire with incredible erudition, his wit with its innocent mockery, his aesthetic sensitivity and moral charm, his basic kindness. In the 20s, this was Aldous. And this was the darling of the avant-garde, of the intelligentsia of Europe. They couldn't wait for his next book. He said the problem with arts back then was that they disrupt the social systems. And all the avant-garde did, yay, viva l'art, viva the arts. But then what happened is, as Aldous started to go deeper into mysticism or look for a different way of forming or finding there were people that could hear a different root, he started to change. And many of the followers weren't ready to go with him, because now he was ready to say that the arts might be a problem because they trapped one in dualism. Therefore, he was suggesting that non-dualism was to be valued. And most people in the arts weren't ready to go that route. And so they started to refer to Aldous as a lay preacher with little to say, which he went on saying. Someone who had lost his genius into fuzzy, confused mysticism. I love it. I love what happens when you turn and you leave behind the mainstream. I mean, once you have opened to the joy of sharing the unshareable, the endless delight of speaking the unspeakable, you do sound like a preacher saying it over and over again. But each time it's fresh, because it's always pointing at the silence. So Aldous went through these stages, perhaps as an old being, finding his form, because he said at one point, I always knew of my inner being. And that reminded me of a beautiful, beautiful line from a wonderful, great saint in India, Anandamayi Ma. Extraordinary, extraordinary being. She had millions and millions of devotees. She was just a free, free spirit. And at one point, she was meeting with Yogananda. And Yogananda said to her, Ma, who are you? And she said, Father, before I was born, I was the same. And then I took birth, and I was the same. And then my parents arranged for my marriage when I had grown, and I was the same. And before you now, I am the same. And later, when I am in the halls of eternity, I shall be the same. That is the wisdom space, the space of timelessness, the space of spacelessness, the awareness, the Rigpa, the Brahman, the space within which form dances. And it seemed as if Aldous was in that space of awareness that was delighting in the forms arising, existing, and passing away. The words I remember most in being with Aldous were extraordinary. Another one was, how odd. And another one was curious. I remember feeling like I was a sort of a butterfly on the end of a needle. That we were all sort of interesting exhibits in the museum of Aldous's perceptual universe. And that quality of equanimity and delight in the way the forms exist So at that point, if you can hear this possibility that the ending to Island and Brave New World are themselves just another part of the dance. And in all parts of the dance, your heart is breaking, and in all parts of the dance, there is joy. There's one more preface, sort of, that I like to talk about Aldous's, about one of the provocative points. For many of us who grew up in a very coercive cultural context, conceptual structure about what was real, and then had the initiation of a psychedelic or trauma or some mystical experience that took us out of that, we saw in a moment how deeply, deeply enmeshed and trapped we had become in the cultural structure. I lived in the time when I was at Harvard before I took psilocybin. I lived in a time where I was a scientist, and science was the high priest of the society. I lived in a time of philosophical materialism, when God was seen as an anthropological curiosity. I lived at a time where the intellect was the ultimate arbiter of truth. And I was so sure of that, and I transmitted that belief so vehemently that I was rewarded by the society again and again. I was a member of the team. And then I took this psilocybin and I realized I'd been had. That the universe was infinitely richer than my petty conceptual structure. And everything my parents had said was just who they thought they were and how they thought it was and what they thought I was. I had bought what they thought I was. That's who I thought I was, with a various set of neuroses I picked up in addition to the ones they gave me along the way. Because I grew up in what Aldous refers to as the telephone booth of single-family dwelling. Locked in a telephone booth with 2 to 3 other people for 14 to 20 years. It's interesting, when I was growing up, a divorce was a no-no. And later, when my friends started to divorce, I had all the no-no in me. We've got to get back to the single-family unit. And then I noticed that some of my friends divorced, and then they remarried, and then all 4 of the parents became friends, and the kids had 2 families to go to, and I realized I was jealous of the kids. Up until then, I was feeling sorry for them. They're children of a divorced family. How terrible. And suddenly I saw the space that they had. And so I think about Aldous's mutual adoption clubs in Ireland. And I saw how he took that idea and spread it into the extended family, in which there is a support system of love and identity and looseness and space to play one neurosis off against the other. Now, I've asked myself, it was so hard in 1961 for me to break out of that model because it was trained in me so heavily. What conditions would I change in the education and caring for a new being into the species to make it possible for that moment of transition to occur more easily, to be able to be integrated more into the wisdom world? For me to be integrated more. Because the experience I had with the psychedelics was a violent, discontinuous moment from where I had been looking at the universe, which then became a subsystem. And in a way, all of our work in thinking about the development of the child, and this is what Aldous was deeply involved in this work, was an attempt to find the way in which a child passes through the phase of necessary dualism that is a proper preparation for them to once again entertain non-dualism, to ultimately integrate the two. Because for a child to learn the terrain, there seems to be the requirement that they become somebody before they can become nobody being somebody. Although they start out in that spaciousness, but then, as Aldous points out in Island, the dualism is necessary for the socialization process to work. So I look at all of this in terms of how would a culture prepare people to be able to have commerce with the mystery, to balance the life of their expectations and hopes and desires and fears and suffering and all that of the world of form, or how to integrate formless and form. Just to give you a little feeling of the darkness of the vision of Brave New World. And the reason it's important, and the way in which Brave New World is provocative to me, is because so many things have crept up on me in our culture that I would hardly notice were it not for a presentation of such a dark mirror as Brave New World against which to look and see this. There are so many ways in which television, technology, transportation, ecological shifts, all of them have come, they've blended into the terrain so much. Advertising, I hardly notice. And then I read Brave New World. And I say, when I look at the Brave New World, I say, it couldn't happen now. And then I look, and it has happened. It has happened. Or it's happening. In Brave New World, the story opens in which you are at the hatchery, because the concept of mother is now an obscene term. We don't need mothers. Because we have given fertile women 6-month bonus in their salary, to donate their ovaries to the state. And these ovaries we keep in a hatchery where we can speed up the process of them producing eggs. And then as the eggs are produced and fertilized, the eggs enter into a process of gestation, during which they are treated in assembly lines in various ways, according to Bokanovsky's process. And the babies are decanted, they're not born. And the extraordinary social engineering, and you've got to hear that this comes out of the natural following of Ford's creation of the assembly line. And the realization that now we can control nature in the sense of the movement of materials, and the only chaotic element in that is the human individuals that have to push the buttons and change them because they may get unhappy at their jobs or something. So we have to socially engineer them to play their part so we have perfect production machines. Because the children, the purpose of the children in Brave New World is for production and consumption. It is an economic model of reality. It is for an efficient and stable society in which the individual has been sacrificed into the society. These eggs are in the process of growing, fertilized eggs. Then some of them are defined as alpha pluses, and they are enriched along the way. And then others are epsilons and deltas and betas who will play different parts in the social structure in the caste system. And therefore, they are denied oxygen at different stages so that they will not have the desire to do the things that the other castes do. And they are even conditioned to avoid hot if we want them to work in a cold region, or avoid cold if they want to work in a hot region. It's all done with negative conditioning in the womb or in the test tube through X-rays, hard X-rays and alcohol. Every time they use the X-ray to stop the egg, it buds, so that ultimately they can get 96 buds from one egg. That means 96 identical twins. From a social scientist point of view who wants to stabilize society, having 96 of the same thing is much better than having just 2 or 1. And in fact, they have worked it out now by getting the ovary to produce more eggs faster, of getting to the point where one donor ovary can, in the course of about 2 years, produce 11,000 genetically similar organisms. So you can have whole assembly lines made up of identical twins. I want you to feel the horror of this. When they are born, they go into a state conditioning nursery. In this state conditioning nursery, they start to have negative conditioning. And they start to be subjected to hypnopedia, to sleep learning. Aldous was fascinated with all of these, with mesmerism, with hypnosis, with sleep learning, with all these wonderful little edges to the relationship of consciousness to awareness, to awakeness, to normal waking consciousness. And in the conditioning, messages were fed to the child during sleep that created the citizen that they wanted in the society. Like, they realized that if they could let everybody have as much sex as they wanted, nobody would get frustrated, desires wouldn't build, and everybody wouldn't get neurotic. So they started with erotic play very early on, encouraging the children to go play in the bushes, which is different than most of us grew up with. It's a great story of a child who comes home from school and the parents say, "What did you discuss at school today?" He said, "We discussed sex." Well, what was that about? Well, the priest came in and he told us why we shouldn't. Then the doctor came in and he told us how we shouldn't. Then the teacher came in and told us where we shouldn't. But here it's a different story. In Brave New World, we have orgy, porgy, Ford, and fun. Kiss the girls and make them one. Boys at one with girls at peace. Orgy, porgy, give release. How would you like to hear that thousands of times in your sleep? Orgy, 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 orgy. It's like watching evening television. Let's take progress, because we have to have you consuming. Progress is lovely. Progress is lovely. Progress is lovely. Progress is lovely. Or how about more stitches, less riches? That is, don't try to save any clothing, throw it away. Or, I do love having new clothes. I do love having new clothes. I do love having new clothes. Thousands of times through your 2-year-old, 3-year-old, I do love having new clothes. How about Never put off until tomorrow the fun you can have today. Never put off until tomorrow the fun you can have today. And then, because it's very important that you be a member of the community, that you don't think for yourself. We don't want that. In fact, alpha pluses even, who try to think for themselves, who have the capacity to do it, are shipped off to an island, because even they have their parts to play. So we have subliminal teaching like, when the individual feels, the community reels. I hate solitude. I hate solitude. I hate solitude. Everyone belongs to everyone else. 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 But dear, I want to have a special relationship with you. Don't talk dirty. Everybody belongs to everyone else. It's self-evident. It's indisputable. We don't want the baby to have a fear of death, which is a great motivator in the social system for weird behavior, as we see in our society. So that the children are taken into the death palace, which is sort of like a feely movie and a good hotel. Latest thing in hospices in 1931. And they get cookies and cakes on death days. So they are positively conditioned to love death. And they never see really old people, because old people receive gonadal hormone treatments, transfusions of young blood, magnesium salts, so they can work and copulate till the very end. No respite from pleasure. You never stop having fun. A 150 times per night for 12 years you hear, everyone's happy now. Everyone's happy now. So you end up with a group of conditioned consciousnesses in which they get what they want and they never want what they can't get. They're safe, they're not afraid of death, they are ignorant of passion and old age, and they never feel strongly about anything. And when it is really working, they say, Ford's in his flivver and all's well with the world. That it's really working. Now, in the story, the alpha pluses are the beings who are the controllers of the system. And their minds are so open that they realize there is history and literature, but anything like history or literature or arts is a threat to the system. So it's kept in locked vaults. And one alpha plus, Bernard, is one of the ones that got into this really sick problem of thinking for himself. And what you're seeing in Brave New World now is the end point of where community consciousness snuffs out individual consciousness, or attempts to. And you will see that Aldous's writings are always dealing with the tension between the need for community, because a child must develop in community, and our creativity comes out of the strength and support of community, at the same moment realizing how quickly community can be coercive, oppressive, and limiting. That's the tension we all are working with. We say, small villages are beautiful. And then if I got your histories of coming, some of you from the Middle West, from small villages, you would be hard-pressed to support that thesis. Bernard is unhappy, and so he decides to take a vacation. And in this vacation, he goes to a reservation where they have some primitive people. It's in Santa Fe, New Mexico, by the way, which I'm sure comes into Aldous' consciousness through his relationship with Lawrence, D.H. Lawrence. And he and this girl, who is very conditioned, go to this reservation. There are a couple of other things I must tell you about. There is also they have a monthly adrenal stimulation. They give you a violent passion surrogate to keep you from getting too violent. That is, instead of all of your adrenaline building up, they flush it out once a month in this wonderful culture. So you're pretty calm. And for relief and time off, you get a dose of Soma. Now, the meaning of Soma is strange, and I don't really think I can go into it, not in the presence of Gene Houston, who could tell you what it is in at least 40 languages. But it's interesting that in this book, Aldous uses it as a pleasure-giving device, as an escape device. And in that sense, it's more like the way in which things like cocaine and crack are used in our society, as releases from unbearable situations for some people. Coke for the middle class and crack for the lower classes that are oppressed. So there is Soma. It's not Soma that's going to liberate your consciousness, because it's Soma given, it's a chemical given to alter consciousness, but it's given in a setting that keeps bringing you back more clearly into the same game you were playing before. It's not a supportive setting for expansion. So Bernard goes off with his lady of the moment, Lenina. Lenina thinks Bernard's kind of an odd duck to want to do this vacation, but she goes. And they meet all these primitive people, a penitente religious group that flog themselves and so on. And they see all of the things you don't see in their society. You see age and sickness and so on. And there they meet a young man named John, who was the child of a woman who got lost on a previous trip to the reservation by somebody from the Brave New World. So his mother grew up with Soma and with wanting new things, and then she ends up having been left behind by the party in this penitente religious group. Bernard is so impressed with this fellow, he decides to bring him back as a sort of an anthropological curiosity to study him. And he brings him back to the reservation, and there the savage meets Mustafa Mond, who is one of the 10 world controllers, one of the great alpha pluses. And there they have a dialogue. And I have asked Bob Benedetti and Stephen Unspar to read you a section from that dialogue.
You don't much like civilization, Mr. Savage?
No. Of course, there are some very nice things. All that music in the air, for instance.
Sometimes 1,000 twanging instruments will hum about my ears, and sometimes voices.
Have you read it, too? I thought nobody knew about that book here in England.
Almost nobody. I'm one of the very few. It's prohibited, you see. But as I make the laws here, I can also break them.
But why is it prohibited?
Because it's old. That's the chief reason. We haven't any use for old things here,
Even when they're beautiful?
particularly when they're beautiful. Beauty's attractive, and we don't want people to be attracted by old things. We want them to like the new ones.
But the new ones are so stupid and horrible. Those plays where there's nothing but helicopters flying about and you feel the people kissing. Goats and monkeys.
Nice, tame animals, anyhow.
Why don't you let them see Othello instead?
No, they couldn't understand it.
Why not?
Because our world is not the same as Othello's world. You can't make tragedies without social instability. The world's stable now.
All the same, Othello's good. Othello's better than those feelies.
Well, of course it is. But high art is the price we have to pay for stability. We have the Feelies and the scent organ instead.
But they don't mean anything.
Well, they mean themselves. They mean a lot of agreeable sensations to the audience. Expecting deltas to know what liberty is, and now expecting them to understand Othello, my dear boy.
I was wondering why you had deltas and epsilons at all. Seeing that you can get whatever you want out of those bottles. Why don't you make everybody an alpha double plus while you're about it?
Because we have no wish to have our throats cut. A society of alphas couldn't fail to be unstable and miserable. Imagine a factory staffed by alphas. Why, an alpha-decanted, alpha-conditioned man would go mad if he had to do epsilon semi-moron work. The optimum population is modeled on the iceberg. 8/9 below the waterline, only 1/9 above.
And they're happy below the waterline?
Happier than above it.
In spite of that awful work they do.
They don't find it awful. Besides, we have our stability to think of. We don't want to change. Every change is a menace to stability. That's another reason why we're so wary of applying inventions. Every discovery in pure science is potentially subversive. So you see, it isn't only art that's incompatible with happiness, it's also science.
What? But you're always saying that science is everything.
Yes, but what sort of science? I was a pretty good physicist in my time. Too good. Good enough to realize that all our science is just a cookery book with an orthodox theory of cooking that nobody's allowed to question. But I was an inquisitive young scullion once. I started doing a bit of cooking on my own. Unorthodox cooking, illicit cooking. A bit of real science, in fact.
What happened?
Just what's going to happen to you. I was on the point of being sent to an island.
An island?
One of the places we send all the people who, for one reason or another, have got too self-consciously individual to fit into community life. All the people who aren't satisfied with orthodoxy, who've got independent ideas of their own. Everyone who, in a word, is anyone. I almost envy them.
Then why aren't you on an island yourself?
Because finally, I preferred this. I was given the choice to be sent to an island where I could have got on with my pure science, or to be taken onto the World Controllers Council. I chose this and let the science go. Sometimes I rather regret it. Happiness is a hard master, especially other people's happiness. But we can't allow science to undo its own good work. You know, it's curious to read what people in the time of R. Ford used to write about scientific progress. They seem to have imagined that it could be allowed to go on indefinitely, regardless of everything else. Knowledge was the highest good, truth the supreme value. True, ideas were beginning to change even then. R. Ford himself did a great deal to shift the emphasis from truth and beauty to comfort and happiness. Still, people went on talking about truth and beauty as though they were the sovereign goods right up to the time of the Third World War. That made them change their tune, all right. What's the point of truth or beauty or knowledge when the atom bombs are popping all about you? People were ready to have even their appetites controlled after that. It hasn't been very good for truth, of course, but it has been very good for happiness. One can't have something for nothing. Happiness has got to be paid for.
Art, science. You seem to have paid a fairly high price for your happiness. Anything else?
Well, religion, of course. There used to be something called God before the Third World War, but I was forgetting. You know all about God, I suppose.
Well,
It's a subject that has always had a great interest for me. Look at these books in my safe. You've never read this, for instance?
the Holy Bible,
Nor this,
The Imitation of Christ,
nor this.
The Varieties of Religious Experience.
And I've got plenty more, a whole collection of pornographic old books. Ford on the shelves and God in the safe.
But if you know about God, why don't you tell them? Why don't you give them these books?
Well, these are about God hundreds of years ago, not about God now.
But God doesn't change.
Well, men do, though.
What difference does that make?
All the difference in the world. God manifests himself in different ways to different men. In pre-modern times, he manifested himself as the being that's described in these books. Now, well, he manifests himself as an absence, as if he weren't there at all.
That's your fault.
Call it the fault of civilization. God isn't compatible with universal happiness. That's why I have to keep these books locked up in the safe. They're smut.
You remember that bit in King Lear? The gods are just, and of our pleasant vices make instruments to plague us. And Edmund answers, you remember he's wounded, he's dying. Thou hast spoken right, 'tis true. The wheel has come full circle. I am here. What about that now? Doesn't there seem to be a God managing things, punishing, rewarding?
Well, does there? The wheel has come full circle. I am here. But where would Edmund be nowadays? Sitting in a pneumatic chair with his arm around a girl's waist, sucking away at his sex hormone chewing gum and looking at the feelies. The gods are just.
Are you sure that Edmund in that pneumatic chair hasn't been just as heavily punished as the Edmund who's been wounded and is bleeding to death? The gods are just. Haven't they used his pleasant vices as an instrument to degrade him?
Degrade him from what position? As a happy, hard-working, goods-consuming citizen, he's perfect.
What about self-denial then? If you had a God, you'd have a reason for self-denial.
But industrial civilization is only possible when there is no self-denial. Self-indulgence up to the very limits imposed by hygiene and economics. Otherwise, the wheels stop turning.
You'd have a reason for chastity.
But chastity means passion. Chastity means neurasthenia, and passion and neurasthenia mean instability, and instability means the end of civilization.
But God's the reason for everything noble and fine and heroic. If you had a
My
God...
dear young friend, a properly organized society has absolutely no need of nobility or heroism. These things are symptoms of political inefficiency. And if ever by some unlucky chance anything unpleasant should ever happen, why, there's always Soma. You swallow 2 or 3 half-gram tablets and there you are. Anybody can be virtuous now. You can carry at least half your morality about in a bottle. Christianity without tears, that's what Soma is.
But the tears are necessary. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing, end them. But you don't do either. Neither suffer nor oppose. You just abolish the slings and arrows. It's too easy.
I wouldn't call it easy. It's taken 3 centuries and our best technology to accomplish it.
Exposing what is mortal and unsure to all that fortune, death, and danger dare, even for an eggshell. Isn't there something in that? Quite apart from God, isn't there something in living dangerously?
Well, there's a great deal in it. Men and women must have their adrenal glands stimulated from time to time.
What?
It's one of the conditions of perfect health. That's why we've made the VPS treatments compulsory.
VPS?
Violent passion surrogate. Regularly, once a month, we flood the whole system with adrenaline. It's the complete physiological equivalent of fear and rage, all the tonic effects of murdering Desdemona and being murdered by Othello without any of the inconvenience.
But I like the inconvenience.
Well, we don't. We prefer to do things comfortably.
But I don't want comfort. I want God. I want poetry. I want real danger. I want freedom. I want goodness. I want sin.
In fact, you are claiming the right to be unhappy.
All right. Then I'm claiming the right to be unhappy.
Not to mention the right to grow old and ugly and impotent, the right to have syphilis and cancer, the right to have too little to eat, the right to be useless and lonely, the right to live in constant anxiety, the right to be tortured by unspeakable pains of every kind.
I claim them all.
You're welcome to them.